So we are very pleased to have today with us in our Bar-Ilan University Vision Science Seminar, Professor Steve Fleming from the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience and the Department of Experimental Psychology at UCL and the Max Planck UCL Center for Computational Psychiatry. Professor Fleming has a BA and MA in psychology with physiology from the University of Oxford, where he graduated with the highest distinction, and a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCL. Following his PhD, he did his postdoc at the University of Oxford as a Sir Henry Wellcome Postdoc Fellow, and during that time, he was also a visiting scholar at NYU. After his postdoc, he joined the Phil at UCL as PI. Today, he is a professor of cognitive neuroscience and a group leader at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL, and he's also a group leader at the Max Planck UCL Center for Computational Psychiatry and Aging Research. Across the years, Steve has received many awards and honors, among them the Philip Lever-Hulme Prize in Psychology, the Rising Star Award from the Association of Psychological Science, the William James Prize from the Association of the Scientific Study of Consciousness, the Gibbs Prize in Psychology, Physiology and Philosophy from the University of Oxford, and the Royal Society Francis Crick Medal and Lecture. His research is consistently funded by prestigious grants as the EPSRC Program Grant, UKRI Future Research Grant, which is the UK equivalent of the ERC Consolidator Scheme, the CFAR Catalyst Grant, and the Templeton Foundation. He has more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and dozens of reviews, commentaries, and book chapters, many of them published in top leading journals as Science, TICS, Nature Communications, Nature Human Behavior, Nature Neuroscience, PNAS, and many more. He has also published 2 books. He has an H-index of 70, according to Google Scholar, with more than 21,000 citations. Over the years, he has supervised more than 40 graduate students and postdocs and has given many invited talks across the world. He is the head of the Meta Lab, and through his research, his group aims to understand the mechanisms supporting human subjective experience and metacognition by employing a combination of psychophysics, brain imaging, and computational modeling. So, for example, his lab is interested in questions like, does metacognition, which is thinking about ourselves, share computational and neural resources with thinking about others? How do we distinguish perception from imagination? What are the functions of conscious experience? How does the brain represent the absence of knowledge? And many more questions like these. While these do not cover all of Steve's research achievements and interests, I will stop here and welcome you, Steve, to our seminar to hear about your exciting research. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Sharon, for that lovely introduction. That was very kind. And it's great, yeah, to have the opportunity to talk to this group. So let me just share my screen here. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So in today's talk, I'm gonna not talk very much about metacognition. I'm going to talk about some newer work we've been doing on thinking about the functions of consciousness. And the first half of the talk will be mainly theoretical. And the second half will be switching to talk about some newer empirical work we've been doing together with Nadina Dijkstra on reality monitoring. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite papers in neuroscience. This is the paper from Biziak and Luzzati on neglect of representational space. So they were studying patients with brain damage in their clinic in Milan, and their patients had spatial neglect. And as many of us are aware, spatial neglect is a condition where you fail to notice or respond to stimuli on one side of your body or space, despite having intact sensory signaling. And usually it's measured in the clinic as a failure to notice aspects of the world. So failing to fill in, say, one side of the clock face when you're asked to reproduce the clock. But what was really lovely and innovative about the Biziak and Luzzati study is that they asked patients not to attend to the outside world, but instead to attend to internally to their imagination. And they were asked to imagine the Piazza del Duomo in Milan and report what they could see from their vantage point, their imagined vantage point. And what they found was when the patient was standing at this end of the square, down where the arrow is here, they would report the shops, bars, and restaurants in their intact uh, hemisphere of space, but they would neglect or fail to mention any of the shops, bars, and restaurants on the other side. And then to ensure this was not just a failure of memory or of knowledge about the square, they simply asked the patients to change their vantage point, to now stand on the steps of the cathedral, look the other way in their mind's eye and say what they could see. And now they started to mention and report the shops, bars, and restaurants on the previously neglected side of space. So I think this really elegant and powerful and very simple study tells us something deep about how the brain works. It tells us that we use perceptual resources to imagine and think about the world. It's a lesson in how neuropsychology can provide beautiful insights into some deep facts about the mind. What this study shows us, I think, is that the tentacles of cognition are reaching deeper into perception than perhaps we like to sometimes think. And I think it also tells us something interesting about the origins and functions of consciousness. So this study is a way into what I want to talk about today, which is what is consciousness for? And we've been getting interested in this over the past couple of years. And our starting point has been to consider from first principles the functions of consciousness. So most theories of consciousness that are out there in the literature often treat the brain as an endpoint. So a stimulus comes in, something happens to it, for instance, recurrent processing or broadcast, or pick your favorite theory, your favorite feature of that theory. And then once that process has occurred, the information becomes conscious. Okay, and but that's treated as the endpoint of the explanation, unless attention has been paid to what functionality that becoming conscious enables the system to do. What are the functional goals of conscious versus unconscious information processing? And this is what Daniel Dennett referred to as the hard question of consciousness, which he always used to pose as, and then what happens? So you've given me some explanation of what happens in the brain to distinguish between conscious and unconscious processing, but why? Why is that in place in the first place? What functionality does that kind of additional conscious representation enable? So what I want to do is start with an evolutionary account that we hope starts tackling that question. So that's going to be the more theoretical aspect of the talk. And then I'll turn to some empirical findings that bear on the functions of visual consciousness, particularly on how humans solve the reality monitoring problem. And I'll mention briefly some newer work on how consciousness affects planning. And then, assuming we still have enough time, I'll mention at the very end some thoughts on how thinking about the functions of consciousness can reframe how we think about the potential of consciousness in artificial systems. So the theoretical part of this work was all done over the past 2 or 3 years now with Matthias Michel, who's a close colleague and collaborator at MIT. He's a philosopher with a strong empirical grounding in the science of consciousness. And this work has been published as a target article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And it was the receipt of a number of commentaries on this proposal. And those commentaries should be coming out, we hear from the journal, in the next few weeks. So the whole treatment should be online over the summer. So do check it out, including our response to those commentaries. So do check that out if it's of interest. So the starting point for this work was to think about the temporal dimension of consciousness, particularly the speed of conscious vision. So everything I'm going to say over the next few slides is focused on conscious vision rather than consciousness more broadly construed. But our hope is that by investigating the functions of conscious vision, we can start to isolate first principles that might have a bearing on consciousness in other senses as well. So the starting point for our proposal is to focus on how fast you become conscious of a stimulus after its onset, so the speed of conscious vision. Why is speed interesting here? Why is it relevant for thinking about the functions of consciousness? Well, the argument is quite a simple one. If conscious vision takes a certain amount of time, then any processes that occur faster than this speed are by definition unconscious. So if I throw a ball towards you and you are able to reach out and catch that in, say, 400 milliseconds, and yet we can show that, for the sake of argument, the time at which you became conscious of that ball takes longer than that time that it takes you to catch it, then we can be fairly secure in our conclusion that the mechanisms involved in you catching the ball were largely unconscious. So knowing which functions can be performed in less than that time that it takes for something to become conscious tells us what functions consciousness might not be important for. And we can start investigating this timescale in a quite a precise way in the vision lab by looking at postdictive phenomena. So postdictive phenomena provide us with a window onto the speed of consciousness. So postdictive effects are effects in which the way you consciously perceive a stimulus is affected by events occurring after that stimulus. So for instance, a classic example is chromatic fusion. So if you flicker, say, a red and green disc alternating rapidly enough, then your percept will be one of a fused yellow disc. And what that's telling us is that the red disc was presented too quickly for it to be consciously perceived, because to consciously perceive the red disc, the green disc would have had to arrive even later. It wouldn't have been able to overwrite the percept of the red disc if conscious perception was fast. Now, chromatic fusion is a relatively fast postdictive phenomena, but there are slower postdictive effects that have been studied in a range of setups. So one of the most famous effects here is in the tactile domain, the cutaneous rabbit illusion. That's a tactile illusion in which the perceived location of a tap on the skin is affected by the location of a subsequent tap. That suggests that we weren't conscious of that initial tap. It can be changed and reshaped by events that occur a bit later on. And this postdictive effect is robust in around the 300 millisecond range. But there are others. So for instance, from Claire Sargent's lab, looking at long-lasting postdiction of detection, and most recently from Michael Herzog's group, looking at long-lasting postdiction of discrimination. So the Herzog effects are particularly striking because of their long-lasting nature and because of the strong impacts they appear to have on people's D prime for discriminating these Vernier offsets. So what they did here is they embedded an initial Vernier offset on the first frame of the task into a moving sequence. So from the observer's perspective, this looks like an initial Vernier that's flashed, and then you see rapidly moving lines going outwards on the screen. And you're asked as the observer to attend to one of those streams. And in that critical stream, in this case on the right-hand side here, sometimes the experimenters would throw in what they called an anti-Vernier. So that's a Vernier that's in the opposite direction as the Vernier that you're actually trying to detect, this one in the middle here. And what they found was that even when this anti-Vernier occurs relatively late in this stream, it would be sufficient to overwrite or cancel out the percept of the pro-Vernier that you were trying to discriminate in the initial frame. Whereas if you throw in another pro-Vernier, they seem to summate and you get an even bigger percept of the initial offset. So that's shown in their data here. It's a complex figure, but essentially what they're showing here is that when you have this Vernier, anti-Vernier within a particular window of integration, these VAV conditions, then even up to around 450 milliseconds in gap between the initial vernier and the anti-vernier, then those percepts integrate and cancel out. So the anti-vernier cancels out the percepts of the central vernier up to around 450 milliseconds after the initial stimulus. This is a D prime effect. It's not a criterion effect. It really does seem to be that those things are getting integrated within this relatively long window. Now, the Richard O'Farrell, who's a PhD student in my lab, has been setting up this paradigm and seeing quite similar effects. So Richard's setup here is somewhat different. We wanted to conceptually replicate the results from Michael's lab, and what we did here was, rather than look at an initial vernier followed by verniers, the anti-vernier occurring later and later in time. Instead, we just kept the offset between the initial vernier, the red one here, and the anti-vernier, the blue one, constant, and just slid the window forward in time. And what that predicts is that at some point, the anti-vernier crosses the boundary of this discrete window and starts to become visible again. And that's exactly what we see. So you see this initial dip in D prime, but then you see a later recovery, and that implies a oscillatory pattern of perceptual sensitivity that's consistent with these windows of integration in around the 300 millisecond range. So just zooming out again for a second, so the broad idea is that there is mounting evidence psychophysically for extended windows of integration in conscious perception between around 250 to 450 milliseconds, depending on the paradigm, depending on the setup, and so on. And I think this is super interesting because it's consistent with surprisingly extended periods of unconscious processing, right? So the window of integration in conscious vision, that's interesting, but it implies that there are lots of things going on unconsciously within that window that we don't have access to, so we can't report, we can't use them to guide subjective reports about the stimulus, despite us having the intuition that we would have seen it, especially in that in the Herzog paradigm. You kind of have the sense, if you're a subject in that paradigm, that it's clearly presented, it's at fixation, it's in the middle, it's the first thing that hits the screen. And so you as a subject have the intuition that you would have, that's just something you would have seen. And yet your D prime data suggests that you don't see it, or you at least have extremely attenuated sensitivity for discriminating that initial stimulus if it's cancelled out by something that appears quite a lot later on. Okay, so that's the data on timescale. And then what we do in the paper with Matthias is build on this to take some broad lessons for what the implications might be for the functions of consciousness. So this is a quote from Bob Kentridge, who says, if these postdictive effects tell us about the timescale of conscious vision, then basing responses to threats and opportunities in the environment on these kinds of windows delayed by 400 plus milliseconds would be seriously maladaptive. So the idea is that the function of conscious vision is unlikely to be for the online control of action in response to immediate sensory stimulation, because otherwise we would have to just wait too long to be able to rapidly respond to something that's, say, about to hit us or about to eat us. And this broader picture is consistent with work pioneered by Mel Goodale and David Milner on dissociations between the online control of action and conscious vision, the distinction between the dorsal and ventral visual streams, and more generally the idea that there can be lots of quite fine-grained control of action that dissociate away from the conscious model of the world that we build, and we think in the paper with Matthias, we propose we use for something else. And I'll get on to what that something else is in a second. There's also, plenty of data floating around in modern life that suggests that this picture of how we control rapid responses may be dissociating from um, our conscious experience. So data, so just the the fact that elite sports people are able to make some very swift responses to, say, cricket balls or tennis balls coming down at 90 or 100 mile an hour, just anecdotally seems to suggest that we're able to perform some quite complex things before we have the time for conscious perception to get into the game. And what was interesting for us, for Matthias and I, was a one of the commentaries on our BBS paper flagged to us that this is not just anecdote. There's actual data out there to suggest that this might be along the right line. So this is data from the sports scientist David Mann. He wrote a commentary with Wayne Wu on our BBS paper. And what David Mann has done in these extremely clever experiments has recruited elite cricketers to go into a cricket net and face a bowling machine where the balls are coming down at, I think it's something like 70, 80 mile an hour. It's what you would receive from a professional fast bowler. And he then puts goggles on the batter that blur their vision, and you can see on the left hand side there the effects that has subjectively on what they're seeing from the bowler. And what they find is that, and this is a quote from their commentary, batters need to be blurred down to the point of legal blindness before their performance even starts to decrease, as measured both objectively and also by ratings of people watching, scoring how good the shot was. So that in itself is amazing, that the cricketers are able to still perform at a very high level despite their vision being blurred down to by a very high degree. It suggests that these coarser grained lower spatial frequencies might be sufficient to guide performance. But perhaps more importantly, for my purposes today, the batters themselves don't think they're going to be able to perform. They're typically terrified, as this commentary suggests, when the blur is introduced. That makes sense. Like, you're being given goggles that mean that you can't really see, and you're being stuck in front of a bowling machine that's going to be sending down very hard balls at 80 miles an hour. It doesn't sound like a fun thing to be doing, and yet their performance data suggests they're actually able to perform quite well. So that would be consistent with this idea that the conscious model we have of the world is not necessarily the one that's actually guiding our online responses in the moment. So that brings us to the question then, well, what is conscious as opposed to unconscious vision for? Why doesn't all our behavior take place in the dark, as it were? And to try and address this question, we've been very inspired by work from the evolutionary biologist and roboticist Malcolm McIver, who across a number of papers has advanced this view that for conscious vision, a key evolutionary juncture was the water to land transition around 400 million years ago. So McIver rests on this concept of the sensory horizon. The sensory horizon is very simply how far you can sense beyond yourself. And he points out that the optical properties of water mean that if you're an aquatic animal, you necessarily have a reasonably limited sensory horizon. Even in very clear water, you just cannot see very far compared to the visual range that you enjoy on the land in terrestrial environments. And the implication is that if you're in the water, then because you have this limited sensory horizon, in general, fast or faster sensory motor reflexes need to be dominating your behavior because stimuli are impinging on you relatively late. You're in this quite narrow bubble, and it's not until things get close to you that you realize that they're there. So if a predator is getting close to you, then the only thing you can do is react at the very last minute and escape. Whereas under larger sensory horizons, like the ones that are enjoyed by terrestrial animals, then slower timescales of sensory motor action control become useful. We now have the luxury of time. We can literally see further, and we have the luxury of time in those situations, planning and the ability to think about what to do next based on what you can see around you becomes more useful. You're not stuck in this narrower bubble where you need to be in more reflex mode. So just to make that, hopefully make that intuition a bit clearer, imagine you're driving down a road like this and it's in the daytime and the visibility is reasonably good, and you see quite far down the road, you see an animal start to walk out across the road in front of you. Now, this is a case where you have a pretty big sensory horizon, and this is also a case then where you have the luxury of cognition. You can take your time, you don't need to panic. You can think to yourself, do I just need to slow the car down and let the animal pass, or do I need to pull over? You know, you're relaxed. You're able to deal with this situation based on the fact that you can see what's going on and you can plan what to do next. But now imagine you're in this environment. You're in a much more limited sensory horizon. You can't see very far down the road. And now imagine an animal jumps out at you. All you can do is rapidly turn the wheel and try and avoid that situation. And we would argue that this would happen largely unconsciously. You're being a bit like the cricketer facing those fast balls under the blurred goggles. And so under these shorter sensory horizons, faster reflexive or habitual actions need to guide your behavior. There is simply no time for conscious perception to shape planning. Okay. So that's the general idea behind the sensory horizons proposal. Somewhat more formally, we can say that larger terrestrial sensory horizons can support the luxury of what computational neuroscientists refer to as model-based planning. So that's the idea that you build some kind of internal model of your outside world and you can use that internal model to plan. And this is actually, and I'll come on to this at the end of the talk, this is increasingly popular of a way of thinking of how to train artificial or robotic systems in the reinforcement learning world. Model-based planning is what you want your agent to be able to do if it's able to act flexibly in its environment. And so under these conditions, if you're a model-based animal, then you benefit from simulating possible paths that you might take through your environment. But this comes at a cost. This leads to what we call a reality monitoring problem. So as soon as you become a cognitive agent that has an internal world model, as soon as you are one of these terrestrial animals that has the luxury of cognition, so you can see your environment and be able to plan through it, then you have a reality monitoring problem. You need to keep separate your model of the external environment from the simulations that you're running through it. And we argue that this problem is only faced by animals who enjoy these larger sensory horizons. Agents with more limited sensory horizons, so like most aquatic animals, there are maybe a few exceptions, and we can talk about that if people are interested. But most aquatic animals who are in these smaller sensory motor bubbles, they just don't have a need for this perception cognition interface. They don't need to ever know metacognitively what is real and what is not real, because they're always in this they always have a more direct coupling to their surrounding environment because they're constrained by this smaller sensory motor bubble. So that's the broad argument about what conscious vision might be for. The idea is that it's building a model of our external world. We're using that for simulation and planning, and that imposes a reality monitoring problem. So just to make what I mean by the reality monitoring problem a bit clearer, imagine you're walking down a road and you start hearing a aggressive dog barking over the fence of one of the houses that you're walking past. You might implicitly start thinking to yourself, that's not great. If this fence is quite low, then perhaps you might be quite worried about that dog jumping over the fence and putting you in danger. But all those kind of future simulations that you're running all the time as a model-based agent, you don't want to actually experience them. If we imagine that the dog might jump over the fence, we don't actually want to perceive the dog jumping over the fence. We just want to think of that as a possible thing that might happen. Okay. And so we want to keep separate what's actually going on in the world from what we think might happen in the world. And that's what we call the reality monitoring problem. We need to keep separate our current model of the world from potential simulations that we're running in that model of the world to plan what might happen next. And this is a dynamic process. And this is the kind of final slide on the theoretical proposal here, because this is where we close the loop and we come back to the timescale of conscious perception. So animals face the need to plan in the here and now. The problem is that that here and now is always changing. So the predator is here now, but perhaps wasn't here a few seconds ago. You need to be sensitive to that kind of timescale. And that creates a tension between building a relatively rich and stable model of the world, but losing dynamic coupling with your constantly changing environment. We somehow need to thread the needle between those two goals. So we could wait around forever, gather loads and loads of data, build a really fine-grained, nice internal model of the world, but by the time we've done that, it's out of date and it's not very useful for planning. Or we could be constantly updating, in which case we might not have a very useful model of the world in the first place with which to guide action. So our proposal with Matthias is that this temporal window of integration of conscious perception, the one identified by all these post-dictive phenomena, is the brain's solution to this tension. So the fact that it's, say, 300 or 400 milliseconds in window length, that seems to be a kind of useful, happy medium between taking some time to build a model of what's out there, but not taking so much time that you lose dynamic coupling to your environment. And in one of the commentaries on our BBS paper from Megan Peters, she proposes that perhaps that window of integration is itself set by the statistics in the environment. If you're in a very fast, if you're in a very volatile environment, then you might actually want to shorten your window down to keep the dynamic coupling, whereas if you're in a more stable world, maybe you want to lengthen that window out a bit. And so that provides a nice hypothesis that could actually be tested empirically. Okay, so the interim summary then from the theoretical part is that longer range visual horizons afford the time for visually guided planning. We propose that this capacity is supported by the slow-ish speed of conscious vision. So by slow here, we mean 300 to 400 milliseconds. Instead, online action of the sort where you need to rapidly react to a stimulus, such as a cricket ball or a predator, is guided unconsciously at faster timescales. And the emergence of this visually guided planning, so this function of conscious vision, required the development of reality monitoring strategies to keep perception and simulation separate. So that's the proposal. We think there's lots of hypotheses that come out of that you can empirically test, and several of these we write down in the paper, so please do check out that if you're interested. I want to focus now for the rest of the talk on two of those hypotheses that we've been pursuing empirically in the lab. So the first one is that cognitive agents should have some internal mechanisms for perceptual reality monitoring, for keeping reality and imagination separate. And the second one is that conscious vision should constrain visually guided planning, if that's one of the functions that we're proposing it serves. Okay, so what's the problem of reality monitoring? Well, I've already told you about that at a conceptual level with the dog jumping over the fence. I want to tell you about it now at a more neural level. So we know that there are shared neural underpinnings of both visual perception of the environment and internal mental imagery. So when you're asked to engage in, say, to imagine an apple, then you tend to activate similar regions as those involved in the perception of that apple. And we saw at the very start of the talk, the Biziak and Lusati result show us something similar, that when you're asked to imagine, say, standing on the steps of the Duomo, you recruit similar neural machinery as when you're actually asked to, say, perceive your external world. That's why they seem to see similar types of neglect for those two scenarios. And quite recently, there's data, really beautiful data from Dorisau's lab in using intracranial recordings in humans that show us that when people are asked to imagine simple objects, they recapitulate a similar latent sensory code as when they're actually perceiving those same objects. So this overlap between imagination and perception seems to go all the way down to the level of single neurons. So that then leads to this problem of reality monitoring. So given that degree of overlap in the sensory cortices, how does the brain tell the difference? How do we infer whether sensory activity is reflecting reality or just imagination? And this is a question that I've been pursuing in close collaboration with a former postdoc in my group, Nadina Dijkstra, who has now launched her own lab at UCL, supported by an ERC starting grant, and she's continuing to pursue this work on reality monitoring, and also continuing to study all manner of interesting questions in relation to imagination. So the setup that we developed here was pretty simple. We asked people to imagine low-level visual stimuli, such as this grating on the top right here, embedded in dynamic visual noise. So the dynamic noise, let me play this, look like this. And you had an instruction at the start of the trial, which was like this: imagine a left-tilted grating appearing within the noise as vividly as possible, as if it were really there. So you had a couple of seconds of this dynamic noise. You had to try and imagine that grating as vividly as you could. And then at the end of the trial, we would simply ask you a question about how vivid your imagination was. This kind of a standard self-generated imagery task. The twist, though, and that's the twist that allows us to probe reality monitoring, is that on a subset of trials, which we call these critical combination trials, we actually fade in a real stimulus. We fade in the kind of stimulus that you're trying to also imagine. And on congruent trials, we faded in a grating with the same orientation as the one that you're trying to imagine, whereas on incongruent trials, we faded in a grating of orthogonal orientation. And then at the very end of that critical combination trial, we would ask people a reality monitoring question. We would ask them, on that trial, was there a grating actually presented on the screen, or was what you saw just in your imagination? So that's the question we can ask that allows us to start tapping into whether people can distinguish external stimulation from imagination. So what we found in this initial experiment was that the perception and imagination are intermixed. So when imagination is the same as the incoming stimulus in this congruent or blue condition here, then people are more likely to say that something was actually really on the screen. That's the probability of saying that there was a real stimulus out there on the y-axis here. And in turn, on trials where people were more likely to say something was real, so those are the solid bars here, the trials in which people judge the stimulus as actually being on the screen, the level at which they rated the vividness of their mental imagery actually happened to be quite a bit higher. Okay, so there's this almost like a two-way intermixing. More vivid imagery is associated with a greater likelihood of saying something's real, and congruent imagery is when you say something's real, those are also the trials on which you experience more vivid imagery. So thinking about this a bit more, we thought that one explanation of this pattern is that perhaps the brain is actually using the vividness of the internal representation to judge whether something is real or imagined, given that one of the most striking differences between imagery and perception is the amount of detail or vividness in the experience. And this is not a new idea. This had already been pointed out by David Hume in his treatise on human nature, in which he wrote the idea or the imagination of red, which we form in the dark, differs only in degrees of intensity, not in nature, from the impression or the perception of red that strikes our eyes in the sunshine. So Hume is arguing for just a quantitative difference between imagination and perception, not any kind of qualitative separation. So our hypothesis then is that this difference in sensory strength or precision is being used by the brain to infer whether it reflects reality or imagination. And we refer to this as the reality threshold model. And we can write that down more formally by saying, positing the idea that there's some kind of common sensory neural population, similar to these single units that in Doris Sauer's experiments are getting driven both by perception and imagery. And we can say that this intermixed activity is then referenced against an internal threshold. And if it's strong enough, if it crosses that internal threshold, this dotted line here, then we say that subjects are going to treat it as real, okay? And whereas if it's below that internal threshold, then they're going to treat it as imagined. So the idea is that reality monitoring is some kind of decision process. The brain doesn't know whether something is real or imagined, but it's using the features of internal sensory activity to try and figure that out. So the nice thing about writing down equations for a simple model like this is that we can use this to simulate what would happen in our experiment and then compare it to what we actually found. So the way we simulated this is just by extending out classical signal detection theory. So rather than drawing samples from a distribution that's conditioned on the input, the actual stimulus, we also condition these samples on internal imagery. So we assume there's some kind of common population where we sample both from perception and imagery, and then we create this intermixed representation. And the nice thing about this model is that if you remember, this was the empirical pattern that I showed you earlier, this intermixing between imagery and perception. That's recapitulated qualitatively very nicely by simulating from this simple model. Now, that's perhaps not so surprising because we developed this model to try and match that empirical pattern. So it'd be nice if we had a more out of sample test of this model, and that's what we tried to develop next. So we thought to ourselves, what would happen if on those critical combination trials, instead of presenting either a congruent stimulus or an incongruent stimulus, we just presented no stimulus at all. So nothing on the screen. It's like a standard imagery trial, but we still just ask you, was something on the screen or not? Was it real or just imagined? And the model predicts that on those trials, those no stimulus trials, what you should see is that your reality decisions should now be essentially entirely driven by fluctuations in imagery vividness. Because if you have a particularly vivid experience on that particular trial, then that's going to push you over this reality threshold and you're going to say, yeah, that's more likely to be real than imagined. So you have this strong main effect of the reality judgment on the vividness ratings. This is the model predictions here, and that's exactly what we see in the experiment when we actually run this no stimulus experiment. So we think this simple model, this idea of a kind of monitoring process that's trying to figure out whether the strength or precision of the internal sensory representation crosses some kind of threshold to be treated as real, provides quite a parsimonious account of some of the behavioral data we get from these imagery experiments. Okay, so just to briefly mention, so we've now gone on, or Nadina has gone on to replicate this result multiple times in various contexts. We can also look at what happens when we sweep across the whole contrast sensitivity function. So what we see there is that the congruent condition acts as if it's adding a bit of sensory signal to the reality judgment. So you see this leftward shift in the congruent condition in the psychometric function. Interestingly, when we add in a confidence rating at the end of these reality judgments and then measure whether people have metacognitive insight to their the effect of imagery on the responses, they seem to have basically no insight into the fact that when they are imagining something vividly, that's driving them over this threshold. So when you're vividly imagining something, you experience it as being really there, and you also are just as confident in it being really there as if a stimulus is really there. So there's no additional metacognitive insight into the fact we're kind of screwing around with your trial by trial perception here. People lack local metacognition about how imagery is affecting their responses. And then most recently, Nadina's used this computational model in conjunction with brain imaging to try and isolate which brain areas might be tracking this integrated reality signal that's being monitored to derive these reality monitoring judgments. And what she did here was take simulations from the model of what would be the patterns that we would expect in brain imaging data for a region that's carrying this fluctuating signal of sensory strength that's being monitored to drive the reality judgments. And what she found was that there were patterns of activity in the bilateral fusiform gyrus. So these, can you see my mouse? Yeah, you can. Yeah, these areas here that recapitulate all of the qualitative signatures that we would expect for a region that's tracking the intermixing of perception and imagination. And these results indicate that this kind of intermixed signal is predicting on a trial by trial basis people's judgments about whether they think the stimulus is real or imagined. And interestingly, these are this is a very similar area to where Doris Sauer's group find the single units that are showing this intermixing between perception and imagination. We can also look for brain areas that might be involved in monitoring the strength of the intermixed representation or setting this reality threshold. And we can do that by comparing or contrasting activations that are better explained by the binary reality judgment relative to activations that are better explained by the continuous signature of imagery vividness. And when we do that, when we compute that contrast, we see now activations in a network of prefrontal areas, the anterior insula, the pre-SMA, and the caudate nucleus. And some of these areas, for instance, the insula, have been regions that we've been interested in other studies for their role in perceptual metacognition. And in particular, the insula shows strong and consistent coupling with these areas in the fusiform gyrus during these reality monitoring judgments. So we think the anterior insula might be a particularly interesting region where you're getting this multimodal convergence of information that might allow the brain to figure out whether its model of the sensory world is reflecting reality or imagination. So these results are also more broadly consistent with views put forward by Hak-Quan Lau that the brain has the ability to discriminate or distinguish between internally generated signals, externally generated perception, and things that are just treated as noise or should be suppressed entirely from conscious awareness. And under Hak-Quan's account, this provides a psychological basis for consciousness, because under a perceptual reality monitoring account, consciousness is allied with the process of trusting our perceptual signals for use in the service of cognition. So that's a very similar proposal to the one that we have in the paper with Matthias Michel, that the functions of conscious vision are essentially to form a model of the world that we can trust and then use in the service of cognition, of simulation, of planning, and so forth. Just a flag, if you're interested more in the computational details of this, for the past few years, we've been building out models within the framework of Bayesian inference, where we're trying to model these the higher order aspects of monitoring that allow the system to know whether its model of its first order perceptual model is reliable or strong enough. This is a model we call the higher order state space model, where you have extra layers in the hierarchy that are essentially monitoring in a relatively low dimensional way whether a first order world model is reliable. The way this works is it essentially marginalizes over all the content that you might perceive. So it doesn't really care about whether what you're representing is an apple or an orange or anything at all. All it cares about is the reliability or precision of that model that you've built. If it's strong and reliable enough, then the inference concludes that it can be used as a basis for simulation and planning. And with Nadina, we have a preprint that's out fairly recently, where we extend out this model now to incorporate monitoring not only of the strength of that first order representation, but also its precision. And the idea is that this underpins our change in our sense of reality. and allows us to more flexibly start modeling why some people can actually generate very strong internal imagery. So these kind of hyper images that is perceptually strong, but nevertheless is not confused with reality. So we think that this kind of focusing in on these higher order aspects of a Bayesian generative model can start providing explanations of features of imagination and perception that have otherwise been quite difficult to account for. Okay, I what's the time? Okay, yeah, we're okay. So if I do another 5 minutes or so, Sharon, is that okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Okay. So just to flag, we're also doing quite a bit of work in the lab trying to explore other consequences of this framework. So one is the second one I'll very briefly mention, but won't go into detail on, is the notion that conscious vision should constrain visually guided planning. That's the idea behind one of the functions of why certain things are conscious and others are not. This is work that's being led by a postdoc in the lab, Jason Da Silva Castanheira, um, and in collaboration with Nick Shea and Christina Hay. And we have a recent paper that's out in eLife on the first behavioral results from this research program. And what we're doing is we're using this maze navigation paradigm that was originally developed by Mark Ho at NYU, where what we ask people to do is look at this bird's eye view of a maze, and they know they have a start location and a goal location, and then after they've seen the maze for a little while, they then later on get they're required then to navigate their little character around the screen to hit the goal location, but the obstacles go off the screen. So you have to get, it's kind of a visual working memory paradigm where you have to build an initial representation of the maze and then hold that in mind and use it for navigation. And what Mark Ho found in their initial paper is that the kind of things, what you can then do is probe people's subjective awareness of different obstacles in the maze. So at the end, you might be asked, like, how aware were you of this little block here or this little block here, and so on. And what Mark Ho found was that people were aware of the obstacles in the maze that were particularly beneficial for their plan. So that's initially consistent with the view that we're putting forward in the BBS paper. And what Jason has gone on to do is probe that at the level of attentional selection. And what he's found is that there's a deep alignment between what we're conscious of, the aspects of the maze that we're conscious of, and the information available for planning. So the idea here is that low-level visual attention is actively acting to inductively bias the hypothesis space for planning. And planning is shaping your perceptual experience of the maze, even when it's off the screen. So even when you're just holding it in mind, the kind of things that you're, quotes, imagining in your head to try and solve that task are the ones that are useful for you to be able to plan, to make a plan through the maze. So that's broadly consistent. There's lots of work obviously still to do in this area, but that's broadly consistent with the model in which a function of consciousness is to enable model-based planning. Okay, so just then finally, how does all this, now we're going to really zoom out and get speculative, but it's fun to perhaps end on. So how does all this then stack up against the questions about consciousness in current and future AI systems? Well, very generally speaking, you have to kind of take some broad metaphysical stance on the possibilities for consciousness in AI before you can even get this discussion off the ground. So there are some options here, and there's lots of debates in the literature at the moment about the plausibility or viability of these different options. The first option is that you might be an anti-functionalist. You might say there are other things that matter for consciousness that are not about just explaining function and, say, behavioral control. So this is the view that consciousness may be supported by some property of particular types of systems and can't solely be determined by looking at observed functionality or behavior. So one example of this would be biological naturalism, the view that consciousness is intertwined with what it means to with being a biological system, that non-biological systems, that AI systems couldn't be conscious in principle because they just don't have the right kind of substrate. So that'd be an anti-functionalist view, because what matters for consciousness there is not the functions that the system can perform, but the type of thing that it's made of. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a functionalist stance, which says that systems that implement the same functions supporting consciousness in humans would also be conscious. You can have a computational functionalist interpretation of this, where the kind of functions that matter for consciousness are computational. But you could also have a somewhat weaker, more general functionalist stance, in which say the functions that may be only implementable in the details of biology matter. So that's where you could start to have, say, a middle ground between biological naturalism and functionalism. And then a final view would be that the question just doesn't make sense. Like even posing the question about consciousness and AI doesn't make sense, because AI is just too alien from human psychological concept to license discussion of consciousness. It'd be a bit like me asking, is no, I won't even try and come up with an example. It's just like too alien. I can't even think of another example, actually. The AI is fascinating, but it is also quite alien, right, when it comes to psychology. So perhaps then we need to be agnostic about it, because even though it seems to share some of the same psychological categories that we can probe in humans, it's just too different to license discussion of consciousness. So as a confession, I oscillate even in the course of a single day between 2 and 3. I think a functionalist approach generally to explaining mental states and behavior is really powerful. It's paying a lot of dividends in cognitive science. There doesn't seem to be a reason why we can't apply the same approach to AI systems, to put them in our experiments, to do cognition and psychophysics on them and so on. And yet maybe doing so is just a party trick and not really actually revealing anything fundamental about whether it's sensible to extend psychological concepts to them. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that let's all be functionalists for a moment. What would the implications then of our current view be for a functionalist stance towards AI? Well, I think then it does become quite plausible that if we build artificial agents that are planning over internal world models, then they will inherit similar representational problems. They will need a way of keeping reality and simulation separate, and they may develop, either because people have engineered those solutions into the systems, or because they just emerge in virtue of machine learning there, that may resemble the functional cluster that underpins biologically evolved human consciousness. They may need things like reality monitoring, the ability to build a dynamic world model, and the ability to iterate over that. I think that current AI systems are not really doing this. There's a lot of talk and hype about the next generation of systems that maybe focus more on world models. I think robotics is particularly interesting here, because then you might have a dynamic perception action cycle that requires a world model plus model-based planning. And then I think you're getting much closer to the kind of cluster of concepts that we've been interested in research on human consciousness. And this is broadly allied with this view known as computational higher order theory, in which what makes a difference for consciousness in AI systems is this ability to essentially represent the workings of the system, and to know whether you have a reliable representation for use in the service of cognition. And as mentioned in this big position piece led by Patrick Butlin and Robert Long, all of these theories currently do not suggest that any existing AI system is a strong candidate for consciousness. But if computational functionalism is true, then conscious AI systems could realistically be built in the near term. Okay, so just to conclude then, I've argued that the speed of human consciousness places constraints on its functions, that human visual consciousness is surprisingly slow and unlikely to support fast reactions to visual stimuli. Conscious vision offers a solution to computational problems that arise at this massive increase in sensory horizons that occurred at the water to land transition in evolutionary history. Reality monitoring in humans empirically seems to be supported by actually relatively simple or heuristic algorithms that track the strength and reliability of perceptual processing. We don't seem to have any additional insight beyond that into whether things are real or imagined, and that seems to be supported by these visual prefrontal interactions. The experiments we're doing on maze navigation indicates a deep link between conscious perception and planning. If we succeed in building artificial agents that plan over in internal world models, they may inherit similar representational problems, may develop similar solutions. And on this view, consciousness is not something mysterious. It becomes an explanans for how cognitive agents manage internal models. It's fairly run of the mill in that sense. And it's not something I think we should worry unduly about. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was really mind-opening. Well, I don't know even how to say it. So first of all, I wanna ask everybody to unmute yourself, although I know that a few people have already left because of the time, but let's all give Steve a big applaud. It was a really fascinating talk, and I'm sure people have questions. So first of all, are you happy to take questions?
Of course, yeah. Shall I just stop sharing so I can see everybody?
Whatever you
Sure.
prefer. So
Yep.
I can start, of course. I wanted to ask you. So first of all, okay, I see Marissa has a question. So Marissa, I'm just going to ask a short question, and um I want to ask if you think that consciousness is a prerequisite for memory. So in a way, all of these, the idea of having a presentation of the environment in a way, isn't that like what is embedded in memory? And if so, if things like, would you say that if something doesn't enter consciousness, it would eventually not be registered in memory? So would that be, well, I'm not saying it would be it would be sufficient, but at least necessary?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that my my initial thought on that is that they would be separate.
Oh,
They would be
wow.
separate questions. So I can imagine how things that are unconsciously processed. I mean, they just are. Let's take the cricketer example. Okay, so you could imagine training up to become a successful um, cricketer. And parts of your training may well rely on the kind of elite performance that those David Mann experiments suggest are being mediated unconsciously. But that's still kind of stamping in the capacity to perform ever more impressive shots. So procedural memory, the ability to kind of develop a skill, the development of that skill may well be operating in that may well be trained up in that more unconscious realm.
Mm,
But I think certain aspects of memory, for instance, the ability to um, episodically recall, um, to kind of reconstruct a scene, there's plenty of evidence that suggest that overlaps very closely with the kind of systems that are being used for imagining and planning and simulating the future, right? So that seems to be essentially constructing on the fly a um, a model of what might happen or what has happened in the past, and there may not even be a difference between those two processes. It's just the arrow of time is pointing in two different directions, essentially. So in that case, then there would be a very tight intertwining between this capacity for conscious vision, supporting the construction of world models, and the ability to travel back and forward in time, right? So I think that would be one hypothesis you could maybe draw out from this view.
I see. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Marissa, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm not taking the video off.
Hi, Marissa.
Hi. So really interesting question. I have, I guess, two main questions. One of them is whether for any of your argument you have considered people with aphantasia and what the implications are for your experiments. And then the second one, I'm trying to put together in my brain still like the time arguments, right?
Mm,
Because on the one hand, we do have a lot of instances in which we know that visual perception is fast,
yeah.
aware visual perception is fast, right? So you gave us here the exceptions, but we have many, many, many cases in which we know that is the case. And so that to me questions a little bit one of your
Mm,
general conclusions that visual consciousness is slow. And
mhm,
the second thing is I was trying, and on the other hand, we have, as you know, Miriam Spering and I have several experiments showing in which we found these perception action dissociation, but with the eye, right? So I mean, they're very consistent with perception action dissociations of Godel here, just with the same effector with the eye. And in those cases, it is not that the stimulus is ever resolved for you to have a aware perception of it. The stimulus can be there forever. You just cannot resolve it. Your eye acts upon it. But if I understood correctly, some of the Herzog examples and other examples that you gave, there were cases in which it would take longer for the perception to arrive, right? But it does at some point arrive. So I'm trying to, I'm sorry if it's not very articulate, the question, but I'm trying to combine these things. And
yeah, no, really interesting. So I think there's three different things there. So let me try and address them in turn. So the first question about aphantasia, yes, I think this is fascinating, and we haven't empirically studied people with aphantasia, but we do discuss it in the paper.
okay.
And our proposal on this is that aphantasia reflects a more optimal reality monitoring than the rest of the population. So the aphantasics are doing the right thing. They are appropriately suppressing internal simulation from conscious awareness. And this then is quite consistent actually with quite a lot of the data that surprisingly doesn't find many functional deficits or any functional deficits in aphantasia. So you would imagine that if internal imagery is subserving some kind of the fact that internal imagery is conscious is subserving some kind of purpose, then you would imagine people with aphantasia would perform more poorly on, say, visual working memory tasks, and that doesn't seem to be the case. So it seems that and also brain imaging work suggests that you can unconsciously activate the relevant visual representations that you need to solve these visual working memory tasks. So the idea would be that both the images and the aphantasics are internally activating sensory representations that help them solve tasks. And the aphantasics just don't experience those. And our proposal in the paper with Matthias is that that's actually a good thing, because you don't want to confuse your modeling environment with the internal simulations you're running. So our proposal would be that the aphantasics should actually, so the empirical hypothesis that you could actually test is that people with aphantasia should actually have better reality monitoring on paradigms where you could actually generate some kind of low-level confusions. So that would be one hypothesis. So that's aphantasia.
Okay, thanks.
The speed, yeah. So the speed aspect. So we're not saying that you can't experience fast things. So that's important. So the idea behind the Herzog model and the post-dictive integration proposal is that what's being post-dictively integrated is still dynamic. So there could still be very sharp transients, very fast things that are part of that little window of integration, and you still experience those dynamic fast things in real time, as it were. But the idea is that any responses to things that have the motor aspect, if that's very fast relative to the stimulus, then the proposal is that is too fast for that window to be integrated over. So it's not so much the proposal is not over fast perception. The proposal is over fast sensory motor responses. Does that make sense?
Yes, partially. I think that I think it was just one of the assessments at the end was that conscious visual perception is low. And I'm saying that really varies a lot. So in each of them, you're saying that you would have to have a relative time in which action could be earlier. Is that what you're saying?
So yeah, so we're not saying that the content within the percept can be dynamic and fast, like things, but the idea is that so Michael has this little kind of movie model in his TICS paper. So the idea would be that like you have a kind of someone in the editing room who can splice and resplice things together within a window of say 300 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds. But once that's served up into conscious awareness, then you experience all the dynamics. You experience the motion, you experience very fast things happening within that window. It's just the window itself is labile, and things can get rewritten and overwritten and changed and so on. So it's not about the speed of experience. It's about the extent to which consciousness seems to be integrating over a reasonably long time scale.
All right. I have to read more about it, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So and then the last thing is on the eye movements. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that the idea that you can basically have something that's never seen would be consistent with the Herzog data, actually, because there the idea is the anti-vernier is so well integrated with the pro-vernier that you just never see the pro-vernier at all. So you just don't see it, and you have the intuition that you should see it. That's what I was trying to mention in the talk, that as a subject, you kind of feel like, yeah, how would I ever miss
Actually,
that?
like
Right.
in our cases, you don't have that intuition. In
Okay,
the cases that
interesting.
I think you heard the talk
Yeah.
at MIT, in those cases, you don't have the intuition. You're like, you're really clueless.
Okay.
And so yeah, maybe when you come to NYU, I'll show you the examples.
Yeah, great. Sounds good. Thanks, Marissa.
But you don't get that intuition.
Okay, interesting. All right. Well, thanks for your questions. Thanks for coming.
And the eye is correct 98% of the time, right? So the eye direction. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So
Brilliant.
just sorry, very quickly to apologize, and just because it's just friends, I'm recovering from a knee replacement a few days ago, so I'm in bed with my leg up. But I was so interested in the talk that this is the first intellectual thing I'm doing. So thank you, Steve, for bringing me back to
good luck.
for taking my pain away.
I'm honored, and get well soon.
Yes,
thank you.
Yes, from all of us, Marissa.
Thank you.
Is it okay to continue? Because Josh has a question. Mel, you too?
Yeah, if there's time.
Oh, I didn't know because people raise their hands. So, okay. So it's hard for me to choose, but Josh.
All right. Hi. Hi, Steve. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Josh.
Get well soon, Marisa. I actually had a question about the detection experiments with Nadina, but come back to me for that, or we'll talk about it later. I want to maybe just offer an idea about this timing stuff that Marisa was just asking about. I haven't read Michael's paper. I've got this dumb idea. I think it is the dumb idea, right? Which is that we've got mechanisms that are slow, we've got mechanisms that are fast. And when the Vernier appears by itself without any post masks or whatever, you can use all of those mechanisms. They all like that, right? But when you add the post mask, it sort of messes up the slow mechanisms, and so you get worse at the task. But it's just, I don't know what any of that has to do with consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would, yeah. So you can obviously you can talk about all of this stuff without mentioning consciousness. You can say that there are certain windows of integration where the post stimulus seems to interfere with the first one, and so on. I think the broader proposal, which is at the moment more of a hypothesis that's consistent with those data, but what we rest the broad framework on, there's obviously other you can be more conservative and not introduce these windows into the picture. You can say that there's just lots of different mechanisms with lots of different timescales, but the hypothesis is that there's a certain timescale that is privileged when it comes to subjective reports, conscious reports, and that there are other types of behavior that can be guided on faster timescales that are not connected to subjective report. That's the strong version of the hypothesis. But I fully accept that you can talk about all those kind of data without saying, well, there's some privileged longer timescale involved. Yeah.
Let Mel ask the question.
Yes, Mel.
Well, it's a general question about sensory domains. I mean, if you're drying the dishes, you'll often catch the plate as it dropped before you realize it's dropped,
right?
Using proprioception and haptics and so on. So I wonder, can you test the validity or usefulness of the model with respect to exploring what might happen in different sensory domains besides vision? I mean, you've emphasized vision, as everybody does. I just wonder what's happening elsewhere.
Yeah. No, I think absolutely. The proposal is agnostic as to sensory domain in terms of the timescale should be what matters there. So if you do the kind of detailed post-dictive investigations that have mostly been done for vision, but have to some extent been done in the tactile domain as well, and there's a bit of work in the auditory and audiovisual using audiovisual stimuli as well, then whatever timescale that throws up, once you characterize it, then that should impose the constraints on control. So as you say, Mel, if you're able to catch the plate in X milliseconds, and yet your post-dictive experiments show that the integration window is longer than that X than X, then that could provide you with an explanation for why you are unconscious of the correction. Absolutely. I think that so that would be the general way it would connect into post-dictive phenomena. I think where it gets more tricky is the evolutionary side of things. And in the BBS paper, we got a lot of pushback on what about this sense? What about this sense? What about this sense? As you might imagine, especially when it comes to fish and aquatic organisms and so on. And I think it's just the reason the McIver proposal is rich and detailed and I think important is because there's just lots of data about what effects that water to land transition had on the visual modality, and we just have less information about, say, what the aquatic ecology of sound is, for instance. Like what there's just less data on all that. So I think the project could be advanced for all these other senses, and ultimately, ideally, you would advance it for multimodal sensory perception. But we had to limit ourselves to vision because all the relevant data, or some of the relevant data, were there for that. Yeah.
One could imagine some excursions into the blind, particularly blind, and things like that, to look at the relationship between, well, not only sound coming from the environment, but also things like echolocation and that some blind people are very adept at doing.
Yes, and I guess on that front, the echolocation. I mean, I don't know very much about this, but my impression is that that's allowing them to build some kind of world model. That's in a way that would fit with this idea that one function of conscious perception is to have
well, in
longer.
fact, we've talked to Daniel Kish, who's a well-known expert in echolocation, uses himself. He talks about a world out there, like it's it's not as though he's like a sonar operator, looking for battleships. It's very much a world that extends well beyond his body, and it's really interesting to. He can draw things that he has seen.
Very cool.
Yeah. Anyway, I won't take over too much more time. Any more time. Thank you very much for.
Thank you, and
thank you.
Sorry for not noticing you wanted to ask questions. Marisa apologized she had to leave. I also wanted to just a thought that occurred to me when Marisa was talking about the eyes and the eye movements, and that the eyes know.
Yep.
So in a way, you can think of the eyes, if you're looking at saccades, as the active or sensor, like the motor component of the visual system. So in a way, you could maybe differentiate, like moving the eyes, you could consider that in a way the action part of the visual system. So you could, I mean, I'm not saying it necessarily is, but if you do relate to it as the motor part of the visual system, then you can try to see how that fits with your, with the planning or looking into the environment. Adam, I saw that you, Steve, are you okay to take more questions, or
we can? Yeah, no problem.
So I'm not sure Adam has a question or not.
Well, I have a comment. I'm an aphasic, and I've never had a visual image, except dreaming. Okay, my wife has incredibly good visual imagery. And we've been together for many years. So we solve problems in a very complicated manner. For example, anything where we have to judge sizes. She's very, very bad at it. she creates a visual image and it's retinally defined as far as I can tell. So the actual size is unclear, right? Me, I have a sort of a motoric response and I know exactly how big things are. Well, anyway, it doesn't really matter our details. I'm just saying that when I look at the tasks people use to study imagery versus performance, they're often very generic. And I really think a sort of a psychoanalytical approach would be better. Try to actually understand exactly what a person can do on a particular task by interrogating them and talking them through it. I mean, I get so irritated by people who claim that I have visual imagery when I don't, because they don't understand what I do instead. Okay. And it's just, I mean, I had this conversation with Jerry Singer in 1969. This is not a new problem for me, right? I have to try to explain how I solve a problem. And I can, but it's very detailed. And none of the tests that I've seen, I mean, I've been working on visual imagery and the Perky effect for most of my life, just as an example. I've never found a really good set of empirical questions that you can ask people which distinguish the levels of vividness and what they can do for different people. You know, the rating system is from a long time ago. The Gordon's controllability, that's from a long time ago. It's just, I think it's a big weakness in the field, you know, it's just my comment. But if you're going to pursue this, that's my suggestion. Try to take a clinical attitude to, you know, nailing the details. So.
No, thank you. And I am very sympathetic to this notion that, you know, when we try and boil things down to behavioral paradigms that we can standardize across people, we lose the richness of the individual. And in some of the work actually that maybe it just reminded me of one thing that may be of interest. So some work that Jorge Morales and Megan Peters are leading as part of this big Templeton project that I'm involved in. They're looking at decomposing what it means to have a vivid, a rating of having a vivid mental image. So rather than just treating that as a dependent variable that we elicit and we then analyze, we say, well, what underpins that? And they're getting some really interesting results where they can decompose that, and different people have idiosyncrasies in terms of how the underlying features of that mental image, how rich, how saturated it is, how how it maps onto various other features that we're interested in vision science, how that maps onto vividness is different for different people. So I think that can start. It doesn't completely answer, tackle the problem you raised, but I think people are moving in that direction, which is good to see. Yeah. Mel has a question, but you're on mute, Mel.
Yes, Mel, though.
I heard a talk on Saturday by Alfonso Karamazzo where he went back to his early 1990s studies of a person with neglect. In this case, it was right-sided neglect. If you gave them a word like convict, they might say container because they saw the first phoneme but not the rest. If you presented it vertically, they did the same thing. You presented it vertically, so they were doing something with their representation that made them still neglected in the way that it should go. And also when you spelled it backwards, they did the same thing.
Wow. That's amazing.
So that
all of them? All of them?
Oh, there's no all of them. I mean, this is the thing of clinical neuropsychology is that you work with what you get, right? And in this case, it was one individual, but the data were remarkably clear, and it suggests then that there's something different about a concept or a representation from a percept in the nature of neglect, which so the Bisiak thing is great, but you can even push it further, and you can do something with that still reads out like neglect, which is really
That's really interesting. Yeah.
That's
I mean, is it something about reading left to right that they're putting it in?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It's
they're
reading.
putting it in the
Yeah,
space. Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly right. But
yeah.
they're putting it into some space
Yeah, yeah,
in
for
their
sure.
head
Yeah.
that, yeah, yeah. So
Really interesting.
it's a way into trying to understand the relationship or the difference rather between percepts and imagery.
Lovely. Yeah.
So I want to add to that. I recently saw Brad Duchesne's, he has this issue of prosomorphopsia, or I'm not sure how that name of the people who are actually when they are looking. So it's a perceptual phenomena. It's not an imagery phenomena. People have these the faces start to change, and they have these very weird sensations about, that and he has quite a lot of people, I would say, individuals who have come to be examined in his lab. And following what Mel was saying, so some people have very consistent, let's say, face related, I would say, deformations. And that would be consistent across rotations and stuff like that. But for some people, it's the visual, it's the retinotopic space. So they has many different types of let's say coordinate frames or relative that these things happen. Like it changes between individuals. Some have it lower, and sometimes it's consistent across changes, and sometimes not. Some I'm thinking there's probably some that are consistent with what Mel was saying about the text. So I'm not sure that maybe it's just different levels of the processing that are, it depends on where in the levels of processing they have a lesion or some kind of something has gone wrong in the processing. So before I thank you, there's just one thing I thought I have. Well, I can ask you also later, but I was thinking about the issue of the aquatic transition, and then how do salmons navigate? Like, they can cross, I don't know if they cross the whole world, but they, they go back, they have this amazing, I mean, maybe it's not even a spatial map. Maybe
Well, so
it's
that's the key point, right? So Jonathan Birch in one of the commentaries on our paper pushes us on the olfactory gradients, which is they're clearly very important for guiding aquatic behavior. But there's no evidence that I know of. Maybe maybe it will be discovered and will be disproven, and that's great. But there's no evidence that I know of that the fish are maintaining a long-range cognitive map. They're navigating on the basis of local gradients, and that is remarkably effective and phenomenal in that they can do that. That's just right. So there's some kind of evolved capability that is meshing with the ecological niche that allows them to get from A to B in that way. But it's not like when I, travel across the Atlantic, I have some kind of idea of where I'm going. Right. So I'm not sure a salmon has, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is someone will find a kind of place cell for the River Severn, and then they'll find that they're like, oh, I'm getting close. Maybe that's true, but our proposal is that they're not doing that. They're navigating on the basis of relatively local sensory horizons. Yeah.
And maybe it's coded in their DNA in some way. I don't know. Maybe it's even not in their brain. I mean, I don't know. I'm just throwing out.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you so much for a really fascinating and interesting talk and for joining our seminar. So again, really lots of thank you for
thanks so much for everyone for coming. And I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. So thanks, Sharon, for organizing this.
It was great. And next week we will have Professor Bianca Van Camanada, I think I'm from Gießen University. And have a lovely rest of the week, everybody. And thanks again, Steve, for a wonderful talk.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks again. See you all soon. Bye.
See you. Bye.